In the summer of 1945, as the Pacific War approached its violent end, Japan believed it understood the rhythm of American air power. B-29 fleets rose from the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam and turned entire cities into burning ruins night after night. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, all had felt the crushing weight of incendiary raids that left nothing but ashes and twisted metal behind. Every Japanese commander knew which cities were next on the list because the Americans followed a predictable logic. They destroyed industry, then ports, then transportation hubs. Cities that had value were razed. Cities that did not remained quiet. Hiroshima fell into that second category, or so the Japanese believed. Tucked between mountains and lying far from the main industrial networks, Hiroshima was seen as too unimportant, too distant, and too defensively difficult to strike. Japanese commanders considered it a city of troops and administrators, not factories and airfields. Because of that, they assumed it was safe. Hiroshima became a symbol of misguided confidence. Unlike Tokyo, it had no elaborate fire breaks carved through districts. Unlike Osaka, it had no layers of anti-aircraft guns guarding the approaches. Unlike Yokohama and Kawasaki, it had never experienced a night sky filled with American bombers. Its residents had grown used to the distant hum of air raid sirens, triggered by passing reconnaissance planes, but no firestorms ever followed. People began returning from evacuations, convinced the worst had passed. Children walked to school again. Shops reopened. Soldiers from the 2nd General Army Garrison marched through the streets with steady discipline, but little urgency. Even officers at the local headquarters believed that the Americans had already chosen their targets, and Hiroshima simply was not one of them. It was too small, too remote, too inconvenient. No one imagined that being overlooked had put a crosshair over the city. Japanese intelligence helped reinforce this illusion. The distance from Tinian to Hiroshima was long enough that only stripped-down, long-range B-29s could attempt it, and Japanese analysts assumed no such aircraft would be used for a mission requiring surgical accuracy. If the Americans had some new weapon to test, it would be aimed at a larger, more obvious target, a place that mattered in the conventional sense. The irony was that the absence of previous raids became evidence and proof in the minds of Japanese officers that Hiroshima was safe. They believed they had been spared because the city held little strategic value. But in reality, Hiroshima had been intentionally left untouched for a different reason, a reason the Japanese could not have guessed. The United States needed an untouched city, a location whose destruction could be measured with terrible clarity. Hiroshima was not spared. It was selected. Yet on the morning of August 6th, none of this was known to the people living there. Dawn broke with warm sunlight spilling across the delta where 7 rivers cut Hiroshima into narrow islands. Farmers brought vegetables to market. Workers stepped into the tramcars. Students marched to schools that had recently returned to regular schedules after long periods of evacuation. Mothers hung laundry out to dry. Infantry units drilled in open yards, trying to maintain discipline even as food shortages grew worse. High above the city, early morning radar stations detected a lone aircraft approaching from the south. It was not a formation, just a single B-29 flying at high altitude. The watch officers judged it to be a reconnaissance plan. The Americans often sent solitary aircraft ahead of large raids, but Hiroshima had been passed over so many times that the appearance of one lone bomber did not stir concern. Standard procedure dictated that small groups of aircraft did not justify a full alarm, so the signal officers allowed the all-clear to remain in place. Tram lines continued to run. Morning assembly in schools continued without interruption. Soldiers were unaware that a weapon unlike anything in history rested in the belly of the approaching aircraft. What made Hiroshima a perfect candidate for this mission was not its military value, but its shape and structure. The city was flat at its center and ringed with gentle geographical contours that offered no shielding effect. The buildings were close together and made largely of wood and tile. The bridges and rivers formed natural channels where heat and pressure would flow without obstruction. American scientists studying aerial photographs concluded that Hiroshima was almost ideal for demonstrating the destructive power of their new weapon. Japanese commanders had reached the opposite conclusion. They believed the terrain made the city difficult to hit effectively with conventional bombs, and therefore unlikely to attract American attention. Both sides were thinking logically, but only one side understood that logic no longer applied. As the morning advanced, the people of Hiroshima went about their routines, unaware that the world had shifted beneath them. From the windows of the B-29 Enola Gay, the crew watched the Japanese coast glide beneath them in the soft haze of early morning. The bomb bay doors were closed over the enormous uranium bomb named Little Boy. In Hiroshima, no preparations were being made. No shelters opened, no civilians rushed underground. The absence of fear, the calm routines, the lack of warning all came not from bravery, but from a profound miscalculation. Japanese commanders believed the Americans had reached the limit of their bombing capability. They believed no weapon existed that could destroy a city in a single strike. They believed Hiroshima was safe because history itself had proven that one bomb could not do what 1,000 bombers struggled to achieve. They believed in a logic of the past, but the dawn sky carried something from the future, and Hiroshima was about to learn that a single bomb could do what the world had always believed impossible. Before dawn broke on August 6, 1945, the island of Tinian lay under a quiet sky with only the distant rumble of ocean surf touching the air. The ground crews of the United States Army Air Forces moved across the runway and practiced silence, preparing a mission unlike any they had ever handled. Floodlights illuminated the silver skin of a B-29 Superfortress with the name Enola Gay painted under its cockpit. Few of the men working beneath its wings knew what the aircraft carried, or why the mission required secrecy so absolute that even high-ranking officers had only fragments of information. Inside a guarded hut, the final checks were being made on a bomb whose existence had been hidden behind layers of code names and compartmentalized orders. Little Boy rested cradled in a steel loading trolley, its long cylindrical body painted dull gray. The uranium core had been secured only hours earlier by technicians who worked with hands trembling not from fear of the Japanese, but from the knowledge that they were handling something entirely new. The weapon had never been used in combat. Its power existed mostly on paper, in calculations scribbled by scientists in distant laboratories. Yet the officers overseeing the mission carried one unshakable belief: the bomb would work, and if it worked, it would end the war. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the mission, stepped from his tent into the early morning humidity. He walked with the calm confidence of a man who understood the magnitude of his responsibility, even if he could not reveal it to those around him. His crew had been briefed as fully as security allowed. They knew the bomb was powerful. They knew their mission was historic. But only Tibbets and two other specialists understood the true magnitude of what they were about to unleash. Around 3 in the morning, the crew assembled beside the aircraft. Captain Theodore Van Kirk, the navigator, reviewed maps and wind forecasts. Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier, checked the sighting mechanisms he would use to release the weapon. Tail gunner Robert Caron loaded his ammunition, although he suspected the mission would not involve enemy fighters. The Japanese were too depleted and too unprepared to mount a serious interception. The crew climbed aboard through the forward and rear hatches, taking their positions inside the long fuselage. Inside the bomb bay, the massive steel cradle holding Little Boy was secured with multiple safety pins and arming locks. The technicians who had loaded the bomb earlier stood back, watching as if reluctant to leave the weapon. They knew they would never again be so close to something capable of reshaping history in seconds. At 2:45 a.m., the order came through: begin the mission. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared to life, one by one, shaking the humid air. The propellers spun into shining discs as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. Tibbets sat at the controls, listening to the steady hum the engines made when perfectly synchronized. He radioed his crew. "This is it. Let's go. Time to make history." The B-29 lifted smoothly into the darkness, climbing steadily away from Tinian. Below them, the island receded into a scattering of dim lights. Ahead lay over 1,000 miles of open ocean. Inside the cabin, the men settled into the rhythm of long flight. The bomb bay was sealed, but every crewman felt its presence, a silent weight hanging beneath them. Some tried not to think about it, while others could think of nothing else. Sunrise approached as the aircraft neared Iwo Jima, where it rendezvoused with two observation planes, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. The formation turned toward Japan, climbing to 31,000 feet. Beneath them, the Pacific shimmered like polished glass. Above them, the sky brightened into pale blue. In Hiroshima, the morning began in ordinary ways. Tram conductors rang their bells, teachers prepared lessons, soldiers at the 2nd General Army Headquarters reviewed routine patrol schedules. Radar stations detected 3 aircraft approaching and issued a minor alert, but no one treated it seriously. Small numbers of American planes often flew overhead and almost none dropped bombs. Civilians continued walking the streets with baskets of produce or stacks of textbooks. The city had no reason to expect danger. Inside Enola Gay, Tibbets allowed the autopilot to hold altitude as they approached the Japanese coastline. Weather conditions were favorable. Clear skies, light winds, the ideal environment for the bombardier's work. In the cramped nose, Major Farabee leaned over his bomb sight, adjusting knobs and checking his calculations. He spoke calmly over the intercom. Target in sight. Stand by. In the rear of the aircraft, Sergeant Joe Stiberick, the radar countermeasures operator, monitored the scope. He saw nothing threatening, no interceptors, no flak bursts. It was as if the sky itself had surrendered. The silence inside the aircraft grew heavier. Every man felt the moment drawing near, something vast and incomprehensible waiting just ahead. Little Boy remained secured by the last mechanical locks. A specialist on board, Captain William Parsons, made the final preparations. He worked methodically, removing the safety devices and inserting the arming components. When he finished, he spoke with quiet finality. The bomb is live. Ahead, the city of Hiroshima stretched across the delta, glowing in the morning sun. From altitude, the city appeared calm, peaceful, unprepared, utterly unaware. The final turn lined the aircraft directly over the aiming point, the Ioi Bridge, a T-shaped landmark in the center of the city. Farabee steadied the sight. Tibbets held the aircraft level. Then, at 8:15 in the morning, the bombardier pressed the release. Little Boy dropped from the bay with a smooth metallic glide, falling away from the aircraft. Enola Gay lurched upward slightly from the sudden loss of weight. Tibbets banked sharply into a diving turn to escape the blast zone, following the pre-planned maneuver drilled into him repeatedly. None of the crew looked back yet. They would wait for the flash. In Hiroshima, life continued normally for 3 more seconds. Tram cars rolled forward, students opened books, a watchmaker bent over his tools. None of them knew that a weapon, unlike any in history, was descending silently toward the heart of their city. In that moment between release and detonation, the war hovered in a fragile stillness. The old world still existed, but it would not survive the next heartbeat.
At exactly 8:15 in the morning, Little Boy reached the altitude where its firing mechanism triggered. The bomb had fallen for 43 seconds through the clear air above Hiroshima, spinning gently as the arming wires pulled free one by one. Below it, the city stretched across the delta in patterns of streets, bridges, and open markets. People walked, bicycles rattled over cobblestones, and the morning sun cast long shadows from telephone poles and rooflines. No one looked up. No one imagined that the sky above them held the force of a new age waiting to be born in a single flash. Then, without warning, a light brighter than anything on Earth erupted in the sky. It did not bloom like fire or flare like lightning. It came as a blinding sphere of pure white, rising above the city with an intensity that shocked even the crew of Enola Gay, who saw it only as a reflection in their windows. For the people of Hiroshima, the flash arrived faster than thought. A carpenter looked toward the window and saw the world turn white. A teacher standing before her class felt the air thicken in an instant. A soldier in the courtyard of the 2nd General Army Headquarters saw a glare so intense it seemed as if a second sun had descended to the height of the clouds. The explosion took place 600 meters above the ground, a deliberate altitude chosen for maximum destructive effect. The shockwave expanded outward at a speed no human could react to. It raced through the city, flattening wooden houses, instantly crushing walls and cracking steel girders as if they were made of paper. Roof tiles disintegrated, windows vanished into dust. The air itself became a hammer, smashing apart everything in its path. Temperatures near the center of the blast surged higher than any natural fire on Earth. Roofs burst into flame without contact. Clothing ignited in an instant. Painted surfaces blistered and peeled. Metal warped. The wave of heat rolled outward so quickly that people standing blocks away felt the burn before they heard any sound. Only after the blinding flash came the roar. A deep, cracking thunder climbed through the air, reaching Enola Gay even as it banked sharply to escape. The crew looked back just long enough to see a rising column of smoke and dust forming in the shape of a mushroom. Captain Robert Lewis in the co-pilot seat stared in stunned silence before speaking into the intercom. "My God," he said, "look at that." The city below had no time to defend itself. Hiroshima possessed anti-aircraft guns, but none had fired. Japanese radar stations had reported the presence of a few American aircraft, yet no alarms followed because no one believed a single B-29 posed a serious threat. The absence of warning doomed the city. Unlike the firebombing of Tokyo, where thousands of planes and hours of burning created destruction, the devastation of Hiroshima came in a single instant. A radius of more than a mile from the blast center was leveled almost completely. Buildings that had stood for decades vanished in a breath. Others survived only as skeletal frames, stripped of every wall and window. Bridges cracked, streetcars melted where they rested. The rivers cutting through the city glowed with reflected fire. For those outside the immediate blast zone, the experience was equally incomprehensible. People were thrown to the ground by a force they could not see. Some heard nothing but felt the air tear itself apart around them. Others felt a shockwave strike like a giant hand sweeping across the landscape. A doctor at a clinic miles from the detonation saw the walls tremble, then watched a wave of dust and paper swirl inside the building as if the room had been turned upside down. In the distance, the rising column of fire continued to climb. It twisted upward, pulling smoke, debris, and moisture into a towering stem that widened at its peak, forming the iconic mushroom shape now fixed in history. Japanese commanders in nearby districts saw the cloud from dozens of miles away. To them, it looked impossible, a pillar of smoke so massive it dwarfed the mountains behind it. They had no frame of reference. No weapon in any arsenal had ever created such a shape. When they attempted to radio the city, they received only static. The communication lines were gone. The shockwave had severed cables, smashed antennas, and cut every normal method of communication. Pilots and Japanese aircraft based at distant airfields were sent to investigate. As they approached the city, they saw the truth unfold beneath them. Hiroshima lay covered in a spreading haze of ash and fire. Whole districts had vanished, leaving only bare outlines where streets once intersected. Smoke curled from countless points, rising to join the massive cloud that still towered over the city like a monument to an era ending in real time. The pilots circled in disbelief. They reported that a single explosion seemed to have erased the heart of the city. At that moment, Japanese commanders understood only one thing. Whatever had happened in Hiroshima was not a conventional bombing raid. It was not napalm, not demolition charges, not high explosives. It was something entirely new, something capable of doing what history insisted was impossible. One bomb had done to Hiroshima what hundreds of raids had done to Tokyo and Osaka. One bomb had ended a city. In the cabin of Enola Gay, shock lingered in every crewman. They had known intellectually that the bomb would be powerful. They had heard scientists describe yields greater than any weapon ever released. But knowing was different from seeing. From miles away, they watched the cloud rise higher and higher, its base glowing with colors of rust and ember. None of them spoke for long moments. The mission log would later record the bare facts. Bomb dropped, 8:15. Successful detonation. Visual confirmation. But the men inside the aircraft understood something deeper and more unsettling. They had just witnessed the moment when war stepped beyond every boundary it had ever known. The old world ended in that flash, and a new world, one shaped by the atom, was born in the sky over Hiroshima.
When the first fragments of information reached Tokyo, they arrived not as reports, but as confusion. At 8:20 in the morning, several telegraph offices near Hiroshima stopped responding. At 8:23, all radio signals from the city fell silent. At 8:27, the headquarters of the 2nd General Army attempted to send an encoded update, but the transmission broke into static mid-sentence.
Japanese communications officers assumed it was a power outage or a technical failure. Nothing in their training allowed for any other explanation. Hiroshima had never been attacked seriously. It had no strategic factories the Americans valued. It lay far from the main targets, and nothing suggested it would be the site of a decisive blow. The silence from the city was puzzling, but not alarming. And then a weather observation post 40 miles away sent a brief message that stunned every officer who read it. A giant cloud is rising over Hiroshima, column reaching extreme altitude, color unknown, form suggests unnatural explosion. The message ended with the final line, cause unclear. The officers in charge of interpreting these reports struggled to make sense of them. Giant cloud, unnatural explosion, entire communications grid gone. It did not sound like a conventional air raid. It sounded like something they had no words for. At 9:30, the Imperial General Headquarters dispatched a reconnaissance aircraft. The pilot flew toward the city and saw the mushroom cloud hours before the rest of the world would hear its name. He circled at a distance, unsure how close he could approach. Beneath the rolling haze, he saw that the heart of the city was simply gone. Fires burned everywhere. Roads he had flown over many times no longer appeared. Even major landmarks were missing, as if scraped away. He reported what he saw in a trembling voice. Hiroshima has been destroyed. The general receiving the message demanded clarification. Destroyed could not mean what it sounded like. No city could be destroyed by a single bomb. Even the worst American firebombing raids required hundreds of aircraft and hours of attack to inflict catastrophic damage. How could one aircraft possibly do what thousands had struggled to achieve? The pilot tried again. Large area burned. Center of city flattening complete. Clouds still rising. Unable to identify structures. Further approach impossible. The officers in Tokyo stared at one another in disbelief. Some insisted it must have been a massive ammunition depot explosion. Others argued that the Americans had finally used a new chemical incendiary. One senior officer even suggested that the pilot must have mistaken smoke from many small fires for a single event. None of these explanations satisfied the growing sense of dread. If Hiroshima had suffered any normal attack, the city would have sent reports. The army headquarters there would have responded. The police network would have activated. The telephone exchange would have come back online. But nothing came. It was as if the city had been erased from the map. At 10:30, the first ground reports began arriving from rescue teams attempting to approach from the outskirts. They spoke of a blinding flash visible from miles away. They described animals lying on the ground stunned by force. They described buildings collapsed in perfect circles, as though they had been pushed outward from a central point. The officers listening to the reports gradually realized the impossible had happened. One bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. The phrase surged through the command center like a physical shock. The idea was not only terrifying, but destabilizing. Entire doctrines of defense collapsed in an instant. Japan had built its strategy on the assumption that no single weapon could annihilate a city. That assumption had vanished along with the city that once proved it. Generals stood around a massive map of Japan, pinned to the wall. Hundreds of pins marked airfields, supply depots, and evacuation routes. For months, they had prepared for the possibility of an American invasion of the home islands. They had deployed reserve units, built defensive lines, and dug tunnels through mountainous terrain. But what defense existed against a weapon that could obliterate a city without warning? One general pointed to Kyoto, another to Niigata, another to Fukuoka. If Hiroshima could fall in a single instant, any city could. The shock among the high command was not just fear, it was disbelief, so deep it bordered on denial. Several insisted the Americans must have found a way to detonate hundreds of tons of explosives simultaneously. Others speculated about chains of chemical reactions or secret new incendiaries. No one wanted to accept that a single device had done this. The truth was too large, too heavy, too final. And then came the message from Washington broadcast to the world. The United States had dropped an atomic bomb, a new weapon of extraordinary power, capable of destroying an entire city in one blow. The Japanese high command froze. Atomic bomb. The words were unfamiliar, yet carried the weight of something irreversible. Scientists in Japan had warned months earlier that the Americans might be pursuing a nuclear project, but their warnings were dismissed. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to attempt such a weapon, and they assumed the Americans did as well. Now the evidence lay in the smoking ruins of Hiroshima. Soon after the broadcast, Japanese commanders gathered in an emergency council. The mood was grim. They discussed everything from evacuation plans to potential retaliation to the possibility that the Americans possessed more such weapons. No one believed Hiroshima was the final strike. The Americans had unveiled their power. They would use it again. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, any could be next. A general slammed his fist onto the table, shouting that no army, no matter how loyal, could fight against a weapon that erased an entire city in seconds. The room fell into silence as the truth settled. Japan had no defense, no counterstrike, no shield. For the first time since the war began, the High Command realized the war was no longer unwinnable, but unendurable. Hiroshima had forced them to confront a future in which every city could vanish before the decision to surrender even reached the emperor. In that moment, Japan understood that the era of conventional war was over. A new and terrifying age had begun, and they were witnessing its arrival in the rising cloud over Hiroshima.
In the hours after Hiroshima vanished from the map, the Japanese High Command struggled to comprehend what had happened. But far beyond their internal shock, the world itself was shifting. A single bomb had done what generations of military theory insisted was impossible. It had ended a city. It had ended an era. And in doing so, it forced humanity to step across a threshold that could never again be uncrossed. As news spread through Tokyo, ministries, officers, and advisors gathered in whispered clusters, trying to make sense of the new reality. They studied every word of the American announcement. They analyzed every fragment of reconnaissance. They questioned every possible explanation. But the conclusions were always the same and always devastating. A weapon existed that could unleash the power of the atom. A weapon that allowed one bomber, one crew, one release to achieve destruction once possible only through entire fleets of aircraft. A weapon that ignored air defenses, ignored distance, ignored everything upon which Japan had built its hopes for survival. The war no longer followed rules known to man. For decades, Japan believed that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could offset American industry. Their soldiers had proved it in the Philippines, in Malaya, in Burma, in the jungles and seas where they fought with ferocity. But the atomic bomb made clear that courage alone could not stop a weapon born from physics itself. Japanese commanders reviewed maps of every major city in the homeland. Each one now looked like a potential Hiroshima. Kyoto, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama, Niigata, even Tokyo itself, all lay helpless under the shadow of a weapon that cared nothing for fortifications or flak or fighter patrols. A single bomber could undo centuries of history in seconds. That realization shook the foundations of the empire. Panic rose quietly but quickly among civilian officials. Ministers demanded answers from scientists, from military experts, from anyone with knowledge of nuclear theory. A handful of Japanese physicists understood immediately what had happened. They explained that the Americans had achieved a breakthrough previously believed impossible within the time frame of the war. They explained that nothing in Japan's arsenal could counter it. They explained that once the first atomic detonation succeeded, more would follow, because the most difficult step was the first. Their words landed like stones in a silent room. Meanwhile, abroad, the United States watched the aftermath with a mixture of awe and dread. President Truman announced to the world that a new era of warfare had begun. Newspapers printed the phrase, "atomic bomb," in bold letters. Military analysts compared the weapon to the earthquake, to the sun, to the very forces that shaped the planet. Yet, even in the United States, not everyone grasped the scale of change. Only a handful of scientists in the Manhattan Project fully understood what they had created. Many of the air crew who had carried the bomb only began to understand its magnitude when they saw Hiroshima's rising cloud from miles away. Paul Tibbets, the commander of Enola Gay, later said that he felt a rare combination of duty fulfilled and awe for the sheer power unleashed. He knew he had helped end the war, but he also knew that he had witnessed the dawn of something far larger than victory. Back in Japan, the emperor received the first detailed reports late in the day.
They described a city reduced to ruins in seconds. They described a flash visible from miles away. They described the sudden absence of all communication. They described a city that no longer had a center, no longer had order, no longer had shape. The emperor listened in silence, understanding before many of his generals did that the war could no longer continue. He knew that a second bomb could fall at any time. And soon it did, on Nagasaki. The shock of the second atomic blast erased any final doubts. Japan announced its intention to surrender 5 days later. The war in the Pacific ended, not through attrition, not through invasion, not through blockade, but through the arrival of a single new idea. The idea that one bomb could decide the fate of nations. After the surrender, the world entered a period of reflection, mixed with fear. Scientists debated the moral cost of such power. Military planners rewrote doctrines that had stood for decades. Diplomats convened urgent discussions about the future of nuclear weapons. Hiroshima became more than a military target. It became a symbol, a warning, a dividing line between the world that once was and the world that now existed. The city that Japan believed was safe from airstrikes became the place where the future revealed itself in the harshest way possible. It taught every nation that distance was no protection, and that war could no longer rely on numbers of troops or fleets or firepower alone. It taught that technology had outpaced the battlefield, that a single calculation could eclipse all strategy. And it forced humanity to confront the terrifying truth that weapons had reached a point where victory and annihilation could become the same act. In the decades that followed, leaders across the world looked back to August 6, 1945, whenever they spoke of deterrence, peace, and the responsibility that came with scientific power. The mushroom cloud rising above Hiroshima was not only a symbol of destruction, it was the birthmark of a new age. An age where war could never again be waged in the same way. Even today, historians look at Hiroshima not only as the moment the war ended, but as the moment the modern world began. A moment when one bomb proved that the logic of centuries had been overturned. A moment when nations realized that the future of conflict would depend not on armies or fleets, but on decisions made in laboratories and guarded rooms. Japanese commanders once believed Hiroshima was untouchable. They believed distance and geography protected them. They believed one bomb could never destroy a city. On the morning of August 6, 1945, they learned the truth. And the world has lived in that truth ever since.